Hello everyone, it's Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hoi4 video. Per the poll that we had posted to the community page, as I'm sure many of you are aware, I have to get some videos made before it is that I leave for Peru so that I have some things to actually post, which is why we took the second and third place results from previous polls, and we put those up as new polls for you all to vote on. The winner in this case of the first vote is, what if the mustache man had actually listened to Rommel and focused on Africa and not Barbarossa? And wow, you all voted for that by an overwhelming margin. Well, let's dive into it. And just as a reminder before it is that we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and put your suggestion for the next what if down in the comment section below. And in addition to that comment, make sure to like the comments that you think are interesting scenarios, and what we will do is take the top 5 most like of those comments, and we will put that up in a community poll for you all to decide the next video. Anyway, Mustache Man, what if you had focused on Africa and not Barbarossa, where everyone subsequently froze to death? Instead, you could simply overheat. Well, this is certainly one of the more interesting suggestions that people have offered in here because it leaves a lot of possibilities open when talking about things with alternate history. Now, because of the starting point of our scenario, we're actually not going to be beginning here in 1936. Instead, we're going to go right when war breaks out in 1939, just because everything else that we could be talking about for Germany's setup prior to World War II, that's really not going to matter. It's all going to be the exact same thing. In fact, our real scenario that we're talking about here doesn't actually begin until perhaps going into late 1940, early 1941. This being because the Africa Corps, the force that Germany would send to actually support the Italians who were being routed down in North Africa, this was not actually sent down until, the Tunisian campaign, so it was March 1941? This was going to be sent down regardless. The question for our scenario becomes, well, what if Germany had actually dedicated more resources as Rommel had requested? And so with that, my friends, let the fun begin. In the initial stages for the setup for this conflict, really nothing is going to be different. Everything is going to go the same way with the occupation of Czechoslovakia, Danziger War, the actions of focusing on the east with Poland, the deal with the Soviet Union. Every single thing you can think of is the same. There is really no other means of explaining it around. Just as in our timeline, the Germans would sweep through Poland, afterwards moving in through the Netherlands as well as Belgium, and with that, we would have very quickly the fall of the West. An interesting point that we're probably going to divert from in here, or if it even has more of a greater degree in accuracy is what I mean. Turkey during this time was trying to get investments from varying different powers in order to be able to develop their state further. What we will say in this timeline is that the Germans are actually going to invest a little bit more in Turkey, specifically so that they can try to get the Turks on their side. Over the course of World War II, in our own timeline, both the Allies and the Axis were constantly making overtures towards Turkey to specifically try to sway them to join either or. Turkey, during our own timeline, maintained strict neutrality right up until the end of the war, where in February of 1945, they would ultimately join the Allies. By then, of course, things were very obvious which way the winds were turning, so it didn't really matter for anything, and not a single Turk ended up actually dying as a result, or not even dying. Not a single Turk ever saw actual combat during the war. In a world in which Germany tries to focus on Africa, this means that Turkey has a larger role to play, and they're likely going to spend more resources in order to influence them. So it is then that by June of 1940, Germany has conquered essentially everything for Western Europe as well as Poland. All of this is done. Denmark and Norway are under control, and the Italians have actually joined in on the south. And while it is that they made some initial good gains against the British, ultimately their efforts were going to be turned back. The question at this point is that after the massive success of the Germans, do they turn east or do they turn south? Efforts have been put in place in order to try and bomb the British into submission, but they just were not submitting. And so while units had been kept specifically around the Bordeaux region, I believe it was, in order to prepare for Operation Sea Lion, there was just no way that the Germans were able to get any kind of naval superiority or air superiority in order to be able to launch such an invasion. It just wasn't feasible. Therefore, the most reasonable option for the Germans was to try and make the British surrender by cutting them off through efforts of raiding. Just as in our own time, the Italians would face quite a number of issues down in North Africa, and it is here that the Germans would have to make a decision in exactly how much support that they are going to send. The Africa Corps in our timeline was prepared and sent over in, say, February of 1941 in order to be able to start in March of 1941. This was always a very limited amount, and although the numbers did grow in time, one of the key issues that Germany faced, the extensive problem, was the issue with logistics. Down here in Libya, there simply just wasn't enough port capacity. There wasn't enough in the way of actual logistic support to allow large numbers of troops to go down south. As such, you can say, oh, what if the Germans doubled, tripled, or quadrupled their numbers? And the answer is that they would have bled out. There literally would have been no way for them to resupply. The British at this time controlled the Mediterranean, and arguably this means that any supplies that came in would be severely limited and hampered. The argument then has to be made that in order to avoid wasting all of the air power on trying to capitulate Britain through the bombing campaign, instead more air power of Germany is going to be sent southwards in order to try and lay claim to the Mediterranean. German commandos and paratroopers will have to be utilized in order to be able to try and seize Malta, maybe even Gibraltar, and all efforts will have to be made to secure the sea routes. So the argument that we're going to make here then is that not only is the Africa Corps formed earlier, but simultaneously more efforts are going to be put in place towards specifically trying to take out the varying different naval installations across the Mediterranean. Along with the additional air support, the only real thing that can be thought of at this time is to specifically try to improve port capacity. You have to be able to take Malta, you have to be able to take the varying different islands that Britain controls, because if you don't, then this means that your shipping is going to be under constant threat, and you need to be able to control the airways. Again, the biggest problem that the Africa Corps and the Italians had is that there simply was not enough port capacity in order to be able to support them. As a result, this means that what we're going to want to do is try to expand things for our scenario to even work before the Africa Corps can actually come down in large numbers. When, of course, we are presented with the option of Yugoslavia seeking to join the Tripart Pact, the thing about this is that if Germany is focusing more on the south in helping the Italians, in trying to actually push the British and the Allies out, it would actually kind of make more sense that instead of taking a hardline approach, that specifically they would want to put pressure upon the Yugoslavians to submit to their will. From this, we'll actually say that the Germans do agree to let the Yugoslavians in. What we will say is that in this new timeline with increased air presence, this actually allows a team of German commandos with Italian men in order to be able to go and seize the island of Malta. Is this a likely scenario to happen? Maybe not. But if this had managed to succeed, this would severely cripple English capabilities within the Mediterranean. Malta was a key naval base during this time. With the Italians having been pushed all the way out of Benghazi and Tobruk, there simply was no way for them to do anything without German help. After several months of efforts, as the Italians would have been on the back foot, a base would have been built out of Tripoli, which in turn would have allowed German forces to begin to pour into North Africa. With increased air presence down in the south, this would have put greater damage upon the British shipping capability, thus limiting their ability to reinforce nearly as well. Heading into summer of 1941, with the Allies largely distracted trying to hold back the Italians in Greece, which is going as well as you can probably expect, this means that with increased German efforts pushed towards the south, Egypt itself comes under threat, and they're able to make it all the way to Cairo. Though Adolf in our timeline obviously wanted to have war with the Soviet Union, and their terrible performance in the Finnish War, the Winter War, was one of the key driving factors that made him decide that it was going to be a good time to strike the Soviets, despite the wish of Finland's ruling circle having reached out to us regarding the prospect of military cooperation against the Soviet menace to the east, their proposal that they want to allow German troops in order to be able to assist with a war against the Soviet Union, this is something that they're going to allow, but that will not actually happen yet. Even in our own timeline, Barbarossa wasn't supposed to happen as late as it was. If I recall correctly, going back into the history, Barbarossa was supposed to happen in essentially late spring, but instead it happened in summer, which gave very little time for German troops to be able to reach Moscow and capitulate the Soviet Union before the onset of winter. Yes, of course, even in this new timeline in which we are trying to be more diplomatic with Yugoslavia, Italy is still going to do what Italy does best and declare war on everyone when it's not prepared. Yeah, it is possible that because of how successful the Germans would be in this new timeline in Africa, that Italy would actually have the resources to be able to dedicate more forces towards Greece as well as Yugoslavia. That is indeed possible. So it is in this new timeline that we constructed that by perhaps mid to late 1941, the entirety of North Africa is under, well, Italian control. The British have been driven back, the Suez Canal taken over, and this means that crucial supplies from India are no longer able to easily reach the British. Oil and other goods are still going to be imported in large amounts from the United States. So while this is certainly going to have an effect upon the British, it's not as large as what perhaps people think. But when combined with the failed efforts in France and also some of the more pains that could have been happening down in the Mediterranean, this has a very real possibility of leading to UK seeking some kind of terms. The question is, as late as it is in 1941 at this point, it is far too late for the Germans to simply turn around and attack the Soviets. They've expended a lot of time, they've expended a lot of manpower, they've expended a lot of resources down in the south, and they're going to need to recoup those losses before it is that they can plan anything against the Soviets. As an example, one of the key things that they are lacking at this time, as they lacked over the course of the entirety of the war, is oil. They've been trading with the Soviets in order to get this oil, but they need more. It's simply not enough. The argument that one could make in this time is that this is where they're going to look towards the Middle East, specifically to get this oil. Because in this new timeline, they have taken the Suez Canal, because they have control over this region in the Middle East, it's going to allow them access to the untapped markets of the Middle East, but it's not going to be a very significant amount. Most of the oil that we think of in the Middle East wasn't really discovered or rather harvested until going into like the 1950s and 60s. Still, there is some, and this will help with the German demand. The interesting thing that we need to take note of, though, is this right here in Iraq, which you've probably noticed right now says Al-Muthana, Iraq. Over the course of like 1937 heading all the way into 1941, there was a proto-fascist movement within Iraq that in 1941 actually had launched a coup against the government in order to install a pro-German government. This coup would ultimately fail due to a variety of factors, not the least of which was British support in order to stop it. In our new timeline, though, with the British on their back foot, you can make the argument that the Germans were actually able to help this coup succeed, which in turn would allow the Germans to be able to pressure them to joining the war. Which from this, although it would not be necessarily all that much, oil rights in the Middle East that had been granted to the UK would be seized, and instead this would be granted to Germany, allowing it to fuel its war machine. With the loss of these very crucial oil reserves, the UK would be in an even worse position in this time. It is yet another loss to be tacked upon them. With these events moving into late 1941, Bulgaria would seek to join the Axis. And with that, it would mean that the entirety of the Balkans, with the exception of Greece, would be in Axis hands. By this time heading into late fall, Italian Eastern Africa would have been once more again secured. With significantly less resources that have to be strained in the south, it means that far more can be dedicated towards taking out Greece. So let me stand corrected. By the end of 1941, the entirety of the Balkans is under Axis control. It really seems at this point that the Axis cannot be stopped anywhere. The greatest defeats that they had faced prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union was in Africa itself. So in the event of greater Axis resources being dedicated there and an actual victory, it means that they truly would have been seen as unstoppable. Which brings us to a very specific question. Does England actually surrender in this new timeline? The answer is really up in the air, but I'm going to say that the most likely answer is no. Even in our own timeline, there had been a vote of no confidence against Churchill, but that went nowhere. By overwhelming support, he would stay in power, and this was like in 1943. With the Germans having redirected more of their air force to the south in order to be able to control the Mediterranean, this means that the bombing campaign against Britain itself would have likely been significantly lighter. Less resources would have been spent, which, although even in our own timeline, the British had not given up, they were stoic and carried on, there would be even less reason for them to give up in this new timeline as they have suffered less. So, where's the Axis to turn? Well, once more against the Soviet Union. However, this is not going to happen going into late 1941, as invading in winter would be absolute suicide. A date is therefore set, mid-spring 1942. With oil from the Middle East largely now supplementing the German war machine, they don't need nearly as much from the Soviet Union. It would make sense that from this time, the oil that they receive would likely be stockpiled. This way, even in the event of a protracted war with the Soviet Union, they would still have a larger oil reserve to be able to utilize in order to supply their military. At the same time, as I had said prior to this, Turkey is a major factor. Over the course of the 1940s, there was immense pressure from Germany as well as Britain to try and get it to join either side, the Allies or the Axis, and ultimately, as I said, it would join the Allies, but this being in like February of 1945. In our new timeline, at a point in which Germany has miraculously succeeded, in which Turkey is surrounded on literally all sides, it would make sense that perhaps heading into early 1942, that they would be pressured into joining the Axis. But Likely not immediately. In preparation for the conflict, immense amount of pressure we put on Turkey, as well as infrastructure, supply, every single thing that you can think of being built up. Now, the Japanese would have still attacked the Philippines during this time, just as they did in our timeline, which in turn would draw the United States into the war. It's not represented on this game, but one of the key reasons into why the Germans went and declared war upon the US was because specifically they were already at war with the Soviet Union, and they had hoped that by declaring war on the US, it would encourage the Japanese to attack the Soviets from the other side. This ultimately did not happen, but it was a thought. That brings us to late March of 1942, the moment in which the new Operation Barbarossa is launched. The way that things would go in this new timeline is relatively questionable. Only around 9 months or so after the original planned start date, the Soviet Union is still largely feeling the effect of its purges. Anti-Soviet military thinking has been banned, its junior army officers have been purged for ideological thought. In general, it is still suffering from many issues. These would largely be fixed over the span of the next year or so, which in turn would give the Germans significantly more of an advantage than they otherwise would have. Plus, now with additional oil reserves as well as an additional potential year of buildup, this is potentially much stronger. However, at the same time, the Soviets would have also had much greater time to industrialize and prepare. They would have had significantly more factories that could have been utilized to produce greater numbers of goods. For the sake of the argument, we're going to say that things go relatively similar to what they did in our own timeline. The German continuation war is launched, and with that, Germany strikes deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. Massive numbers of men in the hundreds of thousands, even to millions, are encircled, as extremely bloody fighting would ensue all across the Eastern Front. With the entirety of the Balkans, as well as the African front under control, this means that larger amounts of resources are able to be dedicated to the Eastern Front, even though even in our own timeline, they had already seen a lion's share of, well, what was available sent to them. With the rapid advance into warm weather, by summer of 1942, this means that as far as Sevastopol has likely already fallen. It is here, potentially, that the big gamble with Turkey could happen. Years worth of pressure would likely in the end force Turkey to join the Axis, if not in a full degree, at least in an attack upon the Soviet Union. This is what Germany had wanted the entire time. They wanted Turkey to join, to specifically go and attack the Caucasus and seize the oil-rich lands of the Soviets. This was the goal that the Germans had in trying to swing south after Stalingrad and be able to take the oil fields of Baku. With millions of Soviets now either captured or dead, it seems only reasonable that the Turks would see the Germans as their greatest chance of surviving. With such a turn of events, it would make sense that Stalingrad as well as further targets would be able to be reached, as the Soviets would actually have more border to be able to contend with. The fall of Stalingrad could theoretically happen in the span of the next 4 months. However, here is where the biggest problem is. The Soviets have had a year in order to be able to strengthen themselves. On top of that, though the Germans have increased oil supplies, simultaneously they would have expanded significantly more of their resources in order to be able to take over things in Africa. With more of those resources having been spent, more men having died, it doesn't mean that they performed better, it means more things were used. As such, potentially less resources, or relative to the year that they would have had to prepare for Barbarossa, would have been available. This means a stronger Soviet Union and a not all that much stronger Germany. Despite the seizing of the oil fields, the Soviets would still have massive reserves at this time, and would begin throwing millions upon millions of men at the Germans in order to drive them back. By this point, since the United States is also involved, though they may not be able to focus nearly as many efforts into Africa through, say, Operation Torch, simultaneously they will be able to dedicate large amounts of resources towards keeping the Soviets supplied. There is simply no way for the Germans and the Italians to maintain any degree of naval superiority, not with the Americans involved. The continuation war would still fail, just as it did in our timeline, with the Soviets taking over the Finns. Even though the Germans, just as they did in our time, would get just outside of Moscow itself, they simultaneously would not manage to reach it before winter would set in, even with the additional time. Italy is not exactly going to be much help in this timeline either, as even though North Africa was initially a success, it would have been their job to drive further into the south in order to be able to hold the African colonies of the British. Still, the United States would have come with its own Operation Torch, and from here, the British likely would have been able to launch varying different expeditions into Italy itself, which, considering how much more spread out Italy would be in this timeline, it would still have a very hard time dealing with it. Simultaneously, it's not like the Germans would be able to split off many of their forces due to Barbarossa still being ongoing, and now at this point probably facing much more severe Soviet resistance. By mid-1943, Rome itself would still fall. The Germans would likely have to split off some of their forces in order to be able to hold the Italian front, but as it stands, things are going to turn out pretty much like what it did in our own timeline, just on a slightly different schedule. By early 1944, things really would have been turning against the Germans. Their Danish puppet would ultimately betray them, the Soviets would be making massive gains in the east, and on top of that, after reclaiming the Baku oil fields, they would actually sweep into Turkey itself, seizing the rich chromium deposits within it, and taking out another key ally that it needed in the region. From this, they would also manage to sweep down into Iraq, from there seizing the oil that was supplying the German war machine. Thus, in the end, just like in our timeline, Germany fails. Their focus into North Africa didn't actually change things. Instead, the only thing that it served to do is prolong the life of Italy and simultaneously allow them to gain a little bit more oil to utilize. But with giving the Soviets more time to prepare their own troops and forces, this was something that would ultimately weaken them in the end. The British would never actually give up, and even with their losses in North Africa, even in the event that they lose the Suez, they weren't going to simply give in. And by replacing their trade that they would have gotten with India and other parts of their empire with the United States, yes, they would have been in more debt and they wouldn't have been in as good of a position as they were in our timeline, but they would have lasted, and the Germans would have been stretched thin. Really, the only difference for how this is likely to turn out once the actual peace deal launches is that, much in the same way as the eastern part of Europe was turned into the Soviet bloc, Turkey would be a new addition to that. It also would likely face rule by a puppet communist government. But whether or not that means that the war ends up ending earlier, like in late 1944, or whether it lasts all the way into 1945, considering they also have to deal with Turkey, the Germans are likely stretched more thin in the scenario after their involvement in Africa and expended more resources, which means that, really, who can say? Either way, my friends, this has been another alternate history video, and I appreciate each and every one of you who have watched. If you could like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to put your own suggestions down in the comment section below as to what we should do next. Remember, I take the top 5 most liked comments, and I turn that into another video. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends.